It is definitely difficult to address some of it, but we got to move on from the Trump tweets. Take a look in your MacBook. I dropped a file in there. It should say sample visual questions. Okay. And on the AP exam, the first type of question on the multiple choice section was the comparison questions that we had, where it gives you two different columns and it says, what's the accurate comparison? Well, the second type of question are visual questions, which are usually a political cartoon or an infographic of some type. Okay. And you can see here that you've got this political cartoon. And it's got a couple different people in here. And remember, anytime they label something or someone, they do it for a purpose. All right. And you see this guy here who's holding a gun and he's labeled NRA. What does the NRA stand for? That's right. And if you didn't know, you should have looked at the first question. It tells you. The National Rifle Association. And you see here right beside of him as it's somebody yelling, and they're labeled what? Hollywood. Okay. Now, fun fact here: somebody who is a member of the National Rifle Association, are they more likely to be conservative or liberal? Conservative, definitely. All right. And somebody from Hollywood, more likely to be liberal or conservative? Definitely more liberal. All right. And so you have the Hollywood person yelling at the NRA person about you're an irresponsible jerk. Okay. And what do you see here behind the Hollywood person? Movie violence, like lots of slain bodies, and you see the footprints are in red. So it's like, hey, movies, they have their fair share of violence as well. And take a look at the first question, okay? Which of the following most likely represents the point of this political cartoon? All right, take a minute and look and see which answer you think is probably the best suited. Could it be A or B or C or D? The good news is you have a 25% chance of getting it right. Kaylee's making an interesting face, very furrowed brow there. Anybody think you got the answer? No, there's only three of you. All right, Trisha's going to go with C. Agree or disagree? All right, hang on here. And we're going to tell you why. It's definitely, the answer is definitely C. Okay? Definitely C. Hollywood's being hypocritical. Now, you bring up a good point. Several people have mentioned this today, Lena. They're like, well, why is it that A is not right? Okay? And does the NRA definitely, like, you have to realize that sometimes something can be a true statement, but not the correct answer. Okay? And if you look at this cartoon, is it just about the NRA? In fact, I don't even think NRA is the main topic. The main topic is the hypocrisy of Hollywood, because they're saying, hey, owning a gun is not a big deal. We've owned guns for over 200 years now. The real ridiculousness is the amount of violence in our culture thanks to movie and television. So something can be a true statement without being a correct answer. So, like, for example, if I asked you what your favorite food was and you said it's Seventh Mod, like, that's a true statement that it is Seventh Mod, but that's not your favorite food. All right. And that's where you have to watch out for these multiple choice questions. Okay. Second question here: what political ideology would the creator most likely be connected to? Liberal, conservative, socialist, or libertarian? Hmm. No. Whoever made the cartoon. Who do you think the creator of this cartoon, which one would they be most likely connected to? You're absolutely right. It is definitely conservative, because they're trying to point out that it's not just the NRA that is responsible for gun violence in the country. In fact, they're saying that Hollywood, the liberals, are just as culpable, if not more so. Okay, let's look at the second one. Scroll down to the page 2 here. All right, and it's got a graphic with two boxes. The first one says that all voters, approximately 1 in 10 Americans, do not have a government-issued photo ID. Okay, and that's looking at all voters. But then when you look at African American voters, it says approximately 1 in 4 African Americans do not have a government-issued photo ID. All right. Now, just looking at that information without answering the questions, what does that mean about white people? Are they more likely or less likely than a black person to have a photo ID? Way more likely to have a photo ID. If you look at all voters and it's 1 in 10, and then you look at black voters only and it's 1 in 4 that don't have a government ID, that means white people are bringing, like, they would bring an average to where it is. It'd be lower if you didn't have white people in the mix. All right. Now, just in that cartoon or that little graphic alone, what are they suggesting about government IDs in terms of voting? What do you think they want you to see? They don't have what's needed to vote, the resources necessarily to vote in a lot of states, because a lot of states are passing laws that insist that you have a photo ID in order to vote. In fact, West Virginia, they've had that for a while, but they didn't start enforcing it, I think, until 2018. I think that was the first time I've ever been asked to see a photo ID in order to vote. And inherently, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what are they saying about the income of African Americans? They're going to be turned away because they don't have the money to necessarily get an ID, and we don't think of that as like inhibiting that at all. But for some people, that money makes the difference. All right, now take a look at the first question. Based on the infographic, which of the following claims would an opponent of state voter ID laws most likely make? Take a minute and answer that. Infographics are always going to be on the AP exam. Sometimes they're political cartoons, sometimes they're like this. No. And that's something that's the problem. They're like, hey, if you're registered to vote, you don't automatically get a government ID. A lot of people would say that if the government was willing to pay for it, then it would be a different story. Do you think there's anything we can rule out in these answers? Anything that we can say is definitely not the answer? Definitely C, because that has nothing to do with the infographic. Like, we don't know about election fraud and voter confidence. So it's definitely not C. All right. Is there anything else that we could probably rule out? Yeah, the percentage that doesn't tell you just because they have or don't have photo ID doesn't mean anything. So that only leaves A and D. All right. What do you think is the right answer, Kaylee? Okay, that's fine. And for all you listeners at home, the suspense is building. Kaylee says hi. If only I had a camera that could point at Kaylee's face right now. A is the right answer we're looking for. Voter ID laws are likely to decrease turnout among African American voters because they're less likely to have them. All right. Look at the second one here. Now, the second question, I wouldn't expect you to necessarily, like, don't feel bad if you don't get this one, because we haven't talked about ways in which people try to change government policy. But it says, based on the infographic, which of the following strategies would a group seeking to increase voter turnout likely pursue? So if you were part of some group and you want to try to increase voter turnout, which of these would you do? And first of all, find out what you can eliminate. Is there anything of the answers, Lena? Is there anything we can eliminate? Definitely. Like, you wouldn't want to eliminate the Voting Rights Act. And it's like, even if you don't know what that is, you're like, that sounds like it helps voting. So you can eliminate D. Tricia, is there anything else we can eliminate? A, because if you wanted to advocate for stricter voter ID laws, that's going to decrease voter turnout. So now we got it down to B and C. Okay. And there's a reason that one is a better answer than the others. And it was like we were talking about with the last one, where something can be a correct statement, but not the right answer. Kaylee, the pressure's on you again. They've narrowed it down for you to B and C. Do you want to phone a friend? All right, Lena, it's back to you. That's the right answer. Lobby state legislatures to overturn voter ID legislation. What made you pick that? And it's only based like that's a small, like the people in high schools are only a small fraction as opposed to a large swath of people. Now, also something else too, and people miss this. What are the first four words of that question? Based on the infographic. All right. And is there anything about voter registration drive at high schools in that infographic? All right. Look for those words based on the infographic or based on the data. Okay. If they ask you that, they're wanting you to use what's already there. All right. Unfortunately, you were like, hey, this logically makes sense that it would affect more people. And you're right on both counts. Okay. So look, that's the second type of question. You'll see those more frequently. You can X that out. Okay. And let's recap some different things from last week. We were talking about, let's go ahead and get the journal question out of the way. We were talking about different documents and the usefulness of those. And remember, what they want us to do, what they want you all to be able to do is identify certain principles, underlying principles in documents, like the Declaration of Independence. Can you name one of the underlying principles of government that's found in the Declaration? Oof. Yes, power comes from the people, consent of the governed, or natural rights that Thomas Jefferson said everybody has certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They don't expect you to remember everything in the Declaration of Independence, but they do expect you to know some basic principles. Okay? And that's the real key from that. All right. Now, we also mentioned last week that America set up a national government under the Articles of Confederation. And was this national government a weak, strong, or in between national government? Very weak. It didn't have a lot of powers. In fact, it lacked certain powers that a government usually needs. What is one of the most fundamental things that it could not do? They couldn't tax, all right? They had no way to get money. They had no executive branch to enforce the laws. They couldn't regulate commerce or business. In fact, they couldn't even come up with a standing army. The states had to come up with militias. It was really a very weak national government. And remember, they were just terrified of a tyrannical government, so they didn't want to give it a lot of powers. States had all the authority, okay? Now, because of that, it wasn't working out very well, so we wrote the Constitution. And that's another document where we said it embodies the idea that the people are ultimately in charge and that the people give their permission to be governed. All right. And we were talking about the legislative branch, the lawmaking body, which it's bicameral. It has two cameras, one for photo and never mind. I was going to make my joke again, black and white and color photos, bicameral. I do what I can. All right. Clearly, you all have not watched that video yet. Now, listen, we were talking about how Congress has a bicameral legislature. It has a House and a Senate, okay? And because it has a House and a Senate, each one's different. And we were talking about the qualifications. And just to recap where we left off, there are different requirements to be in each one. Like one, you got to be 25, one, you got to be 30, 7 years a citizen in one, 7 years or 9 years a citizen in the other. How long is a House of Representatives term? 2 years. How long is a Senate term? 6. Okay. They had different modes of election. House members have always been directly elected by the people. Senators were chosen by state legislatures. Now, out of those two, and I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but out of those two, the House and the Senate, which one was supposed to be more responsive to what the people wanted? The House, definitely. But why do you know that? They have to be elected, first of all, because they got to, like, the voters can directly take their anger out on them. And also, what's their term like? 2 years. 2 years is nothing in political time. Okay. And so if you're in the House, you got to answer to the people every 2 years. If you're a senator, you didn't have to make the people happy. You simply had to make your state legislature happy, and you only had to do it once every 6 years. That's a lot longer term. Okay. Now we want to talk about the impeachment process. All right. And the impeachment process last year, you got a healthy dose of that. All right. If you paid attention in the news. And the impeachment process, in the Constitution, they gave Congress the authority to get rid of certain officials if they weren't doing their job correctly. All right. And the impeachment process is designed to get rid of people, and we always think of the president. Okay. There's been 3 presidents that have been impeached. Trump is one of them. Who are the other 2? Bill Clinton, the Office, the Tenure of Office Act, Andrew Johnson. Very good. All right. You're like, oh, a push counted for something, right? Okay. Now, impeachment. First of all, let's talk about this. Impeachment is a two-step process. The first part, the House votes whether or not to impeach an official. Okay. The House votes whether or not to impeach an official. And you need a majority of the House to do that. All you need is a simple majority. The House votes whether or not to impeach an official, and all you need is a simple majority. Right? So last year, like out of 435 House members, you only need 218, and Democrats had more than enough to impeach Trump. Right? Now, the House votes to impeach him, but impeachment, a lot of people mistake that process. Okay? Impeachment only means you're putting somebody on trial. Right? It doesn't mean they're automatically kicked out. When you impeach somebody, you're voting to put them on trial. So the House voted to put Donald Trump on trial. Right? And then the Senate, they're the ones who hear the evidence and act as the jury in a trial. So the Senate's going to hold the trial, and they vote whether or not to kick the president or the other official out of office. Right? It's a two-step process. Step one, you vote whether or not to impeach, and that only means you're putting them on trial. Okay? The Senate has to hear the evidence, and they vote whether or not to convict and remove. All right? Now, this is where it gets tricky. To convict and remove them, you need 2/3 of the senators. That's a really high threshold to meet. Okay? You got to have 2/3 of the senators on board. And they put that number so high because they didn't want impeachment and kicking you out of office to be used as like a political weapon. All right? And they were like, hey, we don't want people getting impeached just because you don't, impeached just because you don't like them. All right? But there has to be a good reason. And now there's an interesting question too. What can you be impeached for? And there's 3 things you can be impeached for. 2 of them are really simple. First one is treason. That's pretty simple. You can't betray your country, right? We would frown upon that. Treason is where you betray your country or give aid or comfort to the enemy. The second one, bribery. You can't accept bribes. You can't give bribes. That'll get you impeached, right? Treason, bribery, and the third reason is where things get tricky. They're like, you can impeach somebody for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the third thing. What's the problem with that terminology, high crimes and misdemeanors? It's up for interpretation. Okay? What's a high crime to Lena might not be the same as to me or to Trisha or to Kaylee. High crimes can be different. How about this? Lying under oath. Perjury. Is that a high crime? You're like, yeah, that's pretty serious, right? What about if you're lying under oath about having an affair with a woman? You probably got impeached. But Bill Clinton, that's what he got impeached for perjury. Was that something he should have been impeached for? That's a good question. And the Senate, when they voted whether or not to convict, they only got like 53 yes votes to convict. And they were like, look, I'm not saying cheating on your spouse is a good thing, but we shouldn't kick Bill Clinton out of office for this. That it's simply not worth it. And they're like, that's his personal life. And yeah, he lied about it, but most people would probably lie about it under oath unless they were confronted with evidence. And they're like, we have the evidence on Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, he lied about it under oath, but people didn't take it that seriously in the grand scheme of things. Okay. Donald Trump was, and he didn't, he admitted this much was true, but he said it wasn't necessarily like he didn't consider it a bribe or anything like a quid pro quo, but the Ukraine, Joe Biden's son had a job with an oil company in the Ukraine, and the Trump administration wanted them to open an investigation on the Biden family for any possible illegal operations. Not that they had committed any, but they just wanted the possibility. And the Trump administration said, yeah, America's supposed to give you $300 million in military aid this year. And if you don't open this, if you don't open an investigation into the Biden family, then you can forget about getting that aid. And that essentially, like Congress, the House thought that was an impeachable offense because he was using his position to help himself potentially in a political race. All right. But the Senate looked at it and said, we don't think this is worth kicking him out of office for. In fact, only one Republican voted against Trump, and that was Mitt Romney, who, doesn't not exactly buddies with him. All right. So that's the impeachment process. All right. Now, something else that's important about the impeachment process, too. Why does the House get the job of voting whether or not to put them on trial, and why does the Senate get the job of deciding whether or not to kick them out? That's right. All right. They gave the House that job because they are the ones that represent the people. And if the people are really clamoring for an impeachment, the House can give it to them. But the Senate, they're supposed to be the older, wiser, more mature group that doesn't have to answer to the people. Okay. And look, growing up, you know how elementary teachers especially put like these cheesy little sayings on their their walls and whatever, like shoot for the moon, kids. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. I'm like, oh my gosh. I always hated those as a kid, except there was one that I thought was really true. And I believe it's more true now than ever. And I still see it in some people's rooms that what's right is not always popular, and what's popular is not always right. And that's what the Senate is supposed to represent, that they can make a good, informed decision and not worry about doing what's popular. They can worry about doing what's right. All right. And so, the American people, in terms of wanting impeachment, they've gotten it sometimes, but no president's ever been removed from office. Okay. Now, also, too, you see up there on the screen, the impeachment process has actually drawn a lot of attention at times, including like Andrew Johnson, when he got impeached, they were selling tickets. Like you had to be big time to get in the Senate gallery for that. Same thing with the Clinton impeachment. And boy, it was super awkward in the 90s when they're talking about asking Bill Clinton questions about his sex life in the Oval Office, and it's on national television. And, you talk about secondhand embarrassment. You're just like, oh gosh, I can't. And in the 90s, people did not openly talk about things like they did now. So it was like, it's kind of creepy. All right. Now, Article 1 also mentions, other than the impeachment process, they talk about powers that Congress has. Okay. Remember, we have to make a stronger national government than the one under the Articles of Confederation. And so they wanted to give Congress some specific powers, things that they can do. All right. And the powers that are listed in the Constitution, we call those the enumerated powers. Okay? We refer to those as the enumerated powers, the ones specifically listed in the Constitution. You do not have to remember all the enumerated powers, but daggone it, there are 3 of them that you got to know for sure. All right? Tricia, you can remember the big 3, can't you? Like, which ones are the big 3? All right? Fun fact, take a look at the top one. What's the top one? Oh, snap, girl. You're absolutely right. The power to tax and spend. We're summing it up like that. Congress has the ability to tax and spend. And if there's one thing Congress is good at, it's making taxes and spending your money. Okay? This year alone, the federal government's going to spend $4 trillion. That's trillion with a T. That's a lot of cash. Okay? You're like, oh man. Tax and spend. You're like, I wish I had that kind of money. I could make some things happen. All right? Tax and spend. And remember, that was one of the big deficiencies of the old national government. They couldn't tax and spend. All right? They're like, hey, we don't like taxes, but we always say taxes are like a necessary evil. Okay? So that's one of the big ones. In fact, I would tell you this, the power to tax is the most important power a government can have. Okay? John Marshall said the power to tax is the power to destroy. And he's right. All right? So tax and spend, that's number 1. Okay? Second one you need to know, all right? Regulate commerce with the states. We just call that regulating interstate commerce, okay? And that just means they can make laws about interstate commercial activity. Like any business that goes on between states, the government, national government, can make laws about it. That's what it means to regulate interstate commerce. So like here's an example. The trucking industry. Are there laws about what truckers can and can't do? Yes. Okay. And who gets to make those laws? The national government, because trucking is that business activity or economic activity that crosses state lines. Definitely. Okay. Here's another one. Anybody know what the federal government did to the tobacco age last year? They moved it from 18 to what? 21. Does the national government have the power to do that? Is tobacco a product that goes back and forth across state lines? Then yes, they can regulate or make laws. That's what they mean by regulate. They mean, can they make laws about it? And the answer is yes. Now, here's the problem with that. If they can regulate interstate commerce, can you think of any business that doesn't transport stuff from state to state or any industry? Oh, that's a good question. That goes from state to state all the time. Because, for example, think of everything that Microsoft or Apple produces in California. Where do they get their chips manufactured, the microchips, right? And do they transport it from California to West Virginia so that you can have your wonderful MacBook? Yes. Is that traveling over state lines? Yes, it is. You're getting that from a server in California. So can the federal government make laws about what computer programs can and can't do? Yes, they can. Okay. Hang on. That still means we have a couple minutes. All right. So they can make laws. That gives them a lot of power. Okay. Now we'll talk about how they exploit that and they go a little overboard with it. So they have the power to tax and spend. They have the power to regulate interstate commerce. And the third of the big three, they have the power to declare war. Okay. They have the power to declare war. Those are the ones that if you don't remember any of the other enumerated powers, you've got to know those. Okay? Those three are significant. Now, something else that's important too, if you look at these enumerated powers were designed to fix those deficiencies. Okay? It's kind of like if you got a test back and your teacher let you correct your test. These are the test corrections. Like we talked about under the Articles of Confederation, the national government couldn't coin money. Every state had their own currency. Well, this time they make it clear. Okay. Now, one other thing we want to mention. All right, Congress doesn't just have enumerated powers; they also have what are called implied powers. All right, they also have what are called implied powers. If something's implied, we got a great interruption. We'll pick up with that tomorrow.